What causes an empire to rise from nothing and command the hearts of 3 continents, only to vanish like smoke? It began with a dream beneath Anatolian stars, a tribal chief with no throne, no city, just a vision of a tree whose branches would touch the world. But how did that vision become a force that would conquer Constantinople, challenge Rome, and cast its shadow from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia? Who were the Janissaries? Children stolen from their homes, trained to fight without mercy, yet raised to guard the throne. What really happened behind the gilded screens of the imperial harem, where women with no armies shaped the fate of the world's most powerful men? And what do you make of a civilization that built domes so perfect they seemed to float, but later feared the stars so much they tore down their own observatories? Why did the Ottomans fear the printing press? How did trade routes stitched through silk and gold begin to unravel? What broke at Lepanto? And why did the final Siege of Vienna feel less like a victory and more like a warning? This is not just the story of sultans and swords. It is the story of belief, of ambition, of slow decline, and of the legacy that remains long after the last empire falls. Welcome to the secrets of the Ottoman Empire. The journey begins now. The wind whispered through the olive trees that clung to the hillsides of Sogut, a small village that barely appears on maps today. The soil here is dry, fragrant with sage and thyme, and it clings to your boots like memory. This is where it began, not with a great battle or a grand proclamation, but with a dream beneath the stars. Osman Ghazi, a tribal chief with no throne and no empire, had once laid his head to rest beside a holy man. That night he saw a vision, a tree growing from his chest, its branches spreading across the world. Beneath it, rivers flowed, mountains rose, and cities gleamed like stars fallen to earth. When he woke, the path of his life was forever changed. Historians call it a myth, perhaps even a convenient fiction. But standing here, where the foundations of his tribe once stood, you can feel something in the air. The past clings to the rocks like mist at dawn, and the people who still live here speak of Osman with reverence, as though he only left yesterday. At the time, the world around him was unraveling. The Seljuk Sultanate was a fractured shell, its strength broken by Mongol invasions. Byzantine cities dotted the west like lonely outposts, barely holding on. It was a world in transition, a world waiting for someone to take the reins of fate. And Osman, he listened. He gathered warriors not with gold, but with stories. He promised them not just spoils, but purpose. He wove together Turkish nomads, displaced peasants, and Sufi mystics under a single banner. The sword was important, yes, but so too was belief, and Osman believed he was chosen. In the ruins of an old tekke nearby, I found fragments of old scrolls, water-damaged and half-eaten by time, but the words that survived were enough. They spoke of a leader with fairness in his eyes and iron in his spine, a man who treated enemies with respect and allies with loyalty. It wasn't just the land he conquered, it was hearts. The early Ottomans didn't build cities of stone right away. They moved like the wind, striking quickly then disappearing. Their tactics were tribal, fluid, unpredictable. And as their territory grew, so too did the legend. Other Beyliks noticed and feared, but they were too busy fighting each other to stop what was coming. I visited the tomb where Osman is said to be buried, a simple place, quiet, adorned with green banners and the prayers of pilgrims. No marble arches, no golden domes, just memory and the weight of beginnings. What makes a man think he can build an empire? What makes a single dream burn so brightly that generations follow its light? As I stood there, I thought of the tree from his vision, roots in Sogut, branches in Europe, Arabia, and Africa, leaves that would one day fall, but not yet. The dream of Osman was more than ambition. It was timing. It was belief. It was the slow coiling of history before it strikes. And in that quiet village, long before anyone had heard the name Ottoman, a seed was planted that would grow for over 6 centuries. But the winds of fate are never still for long. In the distance, the silhouette of Constantinople waits, vast, impenetrable, eternal, or so it was thought. And as the story of Osman fades into legend, the story of his descendant begins. A boy sultan, barely more than a man, who would stare down the walls of an empire and see not stone, but destiny. The morning fog clung to the Bosphorus like a veil, silver light bleeding through as the city slowly emerged. Constantinople, the queen of cities. For over 1,000 years her walls held firm. Crusaders, Persians, Arabs, all had tried. All had failed. But in the spring of the year 1453, a boy of 21 stood before those walls with a different fire in his eyes. They called him Mehmed. Later they would call him the Conqueror. But in those early hours, he was just a sultan with a dream that bordered on madness. I stood in the shadow of those same walls, the stone blackened by centuries of war and weather. I ran my fingers across the mortar and felt the tremble of history, because it was here that the age of empires would turn a page. The Ottomans had grown strong in the valleys of Anatolia, but to truly rise, they needed a symbol, a heart for their empire. And Constantinople was more than a city, it was a statement, the last jewel of the Roman world. It shone with churches, towers, libraries, and legends. It was said that angels guarded its gates. Mehmed was determined to prove otherwise. He planned for years, not just with swords and soldiers, but with science. Cannons the size of cottages were cast in Edirne. One of them, the monstrous basilica, could fire stone balls as heavy as a cart. I found one of those stones near the Golden Horn, its surface chipped, moss-covered, but still heavy with intent. The defenders were few, barely 7,000 men, holding back an army nearly 10 times their size. But they had the walls, the Theodosian walls, triple-layered, thick, and defiant. They had survived everything thrown at them, until now. Mehmed's troops surrounded the city. He built fortresses to blockade and a wooden road to drag ships over land. That moment alone, when his navy bypassed the chain of the Golden Horn by crossing a hill, changed the rhythm of siege warfare forever. As I traced the old roadbed carved into the hills, I imagined the sound of creaking wood and straining oxen. The impossible becoming real. For 53 days, the city resisted. Cannon fire thundered night and day. Tunnels collapsed in smoke and screams. And above it all, the Hagia Sophia stood like a silent witness, its dome a prayer against the end of an age. But fate, once stirred, does not retreat. On the 29th of May, just before dawn, the final assault began. Waves of soldiers crashed against the gates. First, the expendables, then the veterans, and finally, the Janissaries. Trained from childhood, silent and merciless, they found a weakness in the wall. The defenders broke. The city fell. Inside the city, chaos ruled. But Mehmed, upon entering the Hagia Sophia, did not burn it. He paused. Then he ordered it preserved. Turned into a mosque, yes, but kept. Revered, even in conquest, he understood the weight of symbols. The Byzantines were gone, their empire a whisper. The Roman story now held in Ottoman hands. I remember standing inside the Hagia Sophia myself, watching the light filter through the upper windows. You can still see Christian mosaics beside Islamic calligraphy, two worlds colliding and then coexisting in stone. What drives a young man to reshape history? Was it destiny, ambition, or simply the desire to step into the pages of eternity? The conquest of Constantinople was not just a victory, it was a signal. The Ottomans were no longer one of many powers, they were the power. But even as Mehmed secured his prize, new questions began to rise. How does one hold such a city? How do you govern a world made from so many broken pieces? To answer that, we must enter the heart of the empire and walk beside the sultan who would turn power into legacy. Suleiman, the lawgiver, the magnificent. The call to prayer echoed across the rooftops of Istanbul as I stood before the Suleymaniye Mosque, its minarets piercing the pale sky like lances of stone. Morning light filtered through thin mist, casting golden hues across the marble courtyard. It was quiet. But not long ago, this was the very pulse of the world. A city at the heart of an empire, and at its helm, a man whose name still resounds across continents, Suleiman. They called him the lawgiver. To the west, he was the magnificent. He ruled for 46 years, longer than any other sultan during what is now remembered as the Ottoman Golden Age. But titles alone cannot contain the man. His shadow stretches across centuries, not because he conquered, but because he defined what the empire would become. When Suleiman ascended the throne in the year 1520, the world trembled in anticipation. He was 30 years old, educated, fluent in multiple languages, a poet, a soldier, a strategist. From the moment he took power, he moved with purpose. His reign was not just expansion, it was transformation. From the dusty plains of Hungary to the burning deserts of Mesopotamia, his armies marched like thunder. The Ottomans reached the gates of Vienna, sailed the Mediterranean with unmatched dominance, and expanded deeper into North Africa. But war was only part of the equation. Suleiman understood that empire, to endure, must be more than force. It must have order, vision, law. Inside the archives of Topkapi Palace, I studied old decrees, each penned in elegant Ottoman script, sealed with his tugra. These were not mere commands, they were instruments of reform. Suleiman overhauled tax systems, standardized legal codes, protected the rights of Christians and Jews under Ottoman rule. Where other empires ruled with fear, he offered structure. He surrounded himself with brilliance. There was Pargali Ibrahim, his grand vizier and closest friend, once a slave, now the second most powerful man in the empire. Their bond shaped policy, diplomacy, and the very fabric of the court, until, like so many in power, that bond frayed and ended in betrayal and silence. And there was Harem, a woman who changed everything. She was no ordinary consort. Captured from what is now Ukraine, Harem rose from concubine to legal wife, something unprecedented in centuries of Ottoman rule. Her influence reached into state affairs, charity networks, even foreign relations. The Sultan wrote poems to her under the name Muhibi. They were filled with longing, devotion, and reverence. In those lines, you do not find a distant ruler, you find a man. Then there was Sinan, the imperial architect. His domes and arches, his mosques and bridges, still rise like frozen prayers. The Suleymani Mosque was his masterpiece, a structure that seems to defy gravity. As I walked its polished floors, I could feel time slow, the symmetry, the light. It is not just a building, it is a philosophy rendered in stone. Under Suleiman, the arts flourished. Calligraphy, miniature painting, music, and scholarship reached unprecedented heights. Trade expanded. Cities grew. The empire pulsed with life. For a brief moment, it seemed unshakable. But history does not move in straight lines. Toward the end of his reign, shadows gathered. Succession became a wound. Sons turned against each other, rivals whispered. The weight of empire began to press down on even the shoulders of the magnificent. Still, Suleiman died on campaign, near the fortress of Sigatfar, his empire at its peak. He never returned to see the cracks beginning to form. But his legacy would linger in every court ruling, every minaret, every echo of poetry drifting through Istanbul's streets. And as his body was buried in secret, hidden to protect it from his enemies, his heart, they say, was buried on the battlefield. Yet even in the age of gold, not all that glitters is unshaken. Beneath the splendor, a storm was forming. A new force was rising. Not in the palace, but in the barracks. The Janissaries were waiting. The old barracks of Edirne creak beneath the weight of silence now. Ivy wraps around archways. Dust gathers on worn stone floors. But once, this place echoed with the synchronized stomp of boots, the clash of blades, and voices raised in war chants older than memory. This was the forge of the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire, warriors without past, without family, without choice, slaves of the sword. The Janissaries were not born Ottoman. They were taken. Through a system known as devshirme, Christian boys from the Balkans and Anatolia were seized from their families, often between the ages of 8 and 15. They were converted to Islam, renamed, and trained not just to fight, but to serve. Their identities were stripped, and in their place, something terrifyingly effective was created. I found an old register in the archives of the palace school. The ink had faded, but the names were still there. Each boy cataloged like a resource, their hometowns, their heights, their promise. It was efficient, cold, and from that coldness, discipline was born. The Janissaries lived under strict codes. They could not marry, they could not trade, they belonged entirely to the sultan. Their loyalty was absolute, their training relentless. They drilled day and night in the art of war. Archery, swordplay, musket fire. They were among the first standing armies in Europe, long before the concept became common elsewhere. They became symbols of fear and awe. At the Siege of Constantinople, it was Janissaries who broke through the final defenses. At Mohacs, they cut down the Hungarian army in hours. They moved as one, precise, unyielding, brutal. But they were more than soldiers. They were an institution, and over time they became a political force no ruler could ignore. I walked the training fields outside Istanbul, where the grass grows tall now, but once bare feet thundered against packed earth. You can almost hear the rhythm of their marches if you stand still. Almost. But beneath the iron discipline, there was always a paradox. These warriors, stolen from their childhoods, became the very heart of Ottoman power. Some rose to incredible heights, commanders, governors, even viziers, their origins forgotten, their loyalties sharpened. In service, they found status. But what was the cost? Some records speak of mothers who fled into forests to hide their sons, of villages that mourned as if for the dead. The devshirme was a wound hidden behind the glint of polished armor. And yet, the system worked for a time. The Janissaries ensured Ottoman dominance for centuries. Their unity, their training, their fearlessness, they made the empire nearly invincible. But power once tasted rarely stays silent. Over generations, the Janissaries changed. They began to marry, to inherit wealth, to trade. They resisted reform, defied sultans, even overthrew them. What had begun as a blade in the hand of the state became a hand of its own, gripping tightly around the empire's throat. Still, in their prime, the Janissaries were unmatched. Their discipline was legend. Their silence on the battlefield a harbinger of doom. And their rise tells a deeper truth about the empire itself, its strength, yes, but also its fragility. The things that hold power together can just as easily pull it apart. As I left the barracks behind, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the parade grounds. The silence returned, but it was not peace, it was memory. And as we follow the path of power, another silence waits, one that hung behind veils and jeweled screens. Not in the barracks, in the harem, where whispers shaped history just as surely as swords. The scent of rosewater still lingers in the faded chambers of Topkapi Palace. Light slips through stained glass windows, scattering colors across tiled walls that once echoed with laughter, secrets, and power. This was the imperial harem. Not just a place of silk cushions and hidden beauties, but a crucible of politics, ambition, and influence. Here, behind the veils, women shaped the fate of empires. Most imagine the harem as a fantasy, a private pleasure garden for sultans. That image is a mirage. The truth is deeper, more complicated, and far more powerful. The women of the harem were not merely ornaments, they were instruments of dynasty, mothers of rulers, keepers of alliances. Sometimes they were the empire's most skilled negotiators. At its height, the harem housed hundreds of women, concubines, consorts, servants, and eunuchs. Yet only a few ever rose to true influence. Those who did so not through seduction, but through intelligence, timing, and political instinct. I wandered through the remains of the Queen Mother's chambers. The air was heavy, quiet, as though history was still listening. This was the seat of true power in the harem, the Valida Sultan. The Valide, mother to the reigning sultan, often ruled behind the curtain. She managed the daily affairs of the palace, controlled access to her son, and directed a network of influence that extended far beyond the walls. Some held more power than ministers. Some even ruled the empire when the sultan was too young or too distracted by war. Harem Sultan was one of them. Born Alexandra, a Christian girl from what is now Ukraine, she was captured and brought to the harem as a concubine. But she would become the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, a break from centuries of Ottoman tradition. She advised him on policy, corresponded with foreign rulers, and founded charitable institutions across the empire. Her letters to Suleiman were filled with poetry, but her moves were pure strategy. Kosem Sultan came later, another captive turned queenmaker. She served as regent for not one but two of her sons, wielding power during a turbulent time. It was said that nothing in the palace happened without her blessing. She rewarded allies, removed enemies, and when she was finally murdered by rivals, it took an entire coup to silence her. In the quiet of the harem baths, I found a single tile, cracked but intact, bearing the name of a sultana long forgotten, a whisper from a time when names could shake thrones. The women here learned early that survival depended not on beauty, but on mastery of court life. They outmaneuvered grand viziers, they bribed, arranged marriages, and played the long game of legacy. The harem was also a school. Young women were educated in languages, music, calligraphy, and etiquette. They were groomed not just to serve, but to rule from behind the scenes. Those who failed disappeared. Those who succeeded became legends whispered in the corridors. But power in the harem came at a cost. Intrigue ran deep. Poisoned sherbets, secret alliances, rivalries that turned fatal. The same lattice screens that hid them also trapped them. Freedom was traded for influence, silence for survival. Still, when the empire stood tallest, the harem stood with it, not in the open, but in the shadows. Their fingerprints are on treaties, reforms, even wars. Their stories, once dismissed, now emerge as central threads in the tapestry of Ottoman power. As I stepped back into the courtyard, the air shifted. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it a sense of something unseen. The harem has long since emptied, but its echoes remain. And just beyond these walls, another echo rises, not in the whispers of women, but in the soaring arches and thunder of footsteps. In stone and symmetry, the architecture of empire was waiting. And so was the man who built it, Sinan, the master of domes. I arrived at the Suleimaniye Mosque just before dawn. The city still slept. A soft wind moved through the empty courtyards, and the marble beneath my feet was cool, smooth, ancient. Above me, domes floated like drifting clouds held in place by some unseen force. This was not just a building, it was a soul given shape. And behind it all stood one man, Sinan. Sinan, the chief architect of the Ottoman Empire. A man born in obscurity, a Christian boy taken by the Devshirme system, trained as a soldier and engineer, and transformed into a master of light and space. By the time he was done, he had reshaped the skyline of Istanbul and etched his name into eternity. He served under 3 sultans, designed over 300 buildings. But it was not just the number, it was the vision. The language he spoke was stone, and through it he expressed the empire's ambition, order, and belief in something beyond the visible. I sat inside the central dome of the Suleimaniye, the silence broken only by the distant call to prayer. Light filtered through stained glass, dancing across calligraphy that curved with grace. The dome seemed weightless, as if suspended not by stone, but by faith. Sinan did not simply imitate, he innovated. He studied the Hagia Sophia, the Byzantine marvel that had dominated for centuries, and asked, what could come next? His answer was not to replicate, but to refine. He understood how sound moved through space, how light could transform emptiness into awe, how balance could quiet the soul. In Edirne, I visited what Sinan himself called his masterpiece, the Selimiye Mosque. Built when he was over 80 years old, it defies expectation. Its dome soars higher than that of the Hagia Sophia, its proportions more harmonious, its structure more daring. And yet, it feels effortless, like a song that always existed, waiting to be sung. Sinan's genius was not limited to mosques. He built bridges, aqueducts, schools, and baths. His designs were practical, resilient, and beautiful. He used local materials. He learned from Persian, Roman, and Anatolian traditions, then blended them into something uniquely Ottoman. I found his grave near the Suleimaniye, small and humble, tucked into a corner that most visitors miss. There is no marble palace, no towering monument, just a quiet stone bearing his name. That was his way. His works were never about him. They were about something greater, a unity between heaven and earth, between empire and eternity. And yet, for all his humility, his legacy is vast. Ottoman architecture after Sinan always looked back to him. He set the standard. He showed that a building could be more than shelter. It could be memory. It could be faith. It could be the silent rhythm of a civilization speaking to itself. Walking beneath his arches, I felt it, the peace of balance, the stillness of design. He did not need words. Every line he carved, every shadow he shaped, speaks still. And what it says is simple. That beauty, when born of devotion, endures. But architecture, like empires, is only one way to hold power. Beyond stone and skyline, something else kept the Ottoman heart beating. Silk, spice, gold. Caravans that whispered across deserts and mountains. The rhythm of trade, pulsing through the veins of the empire. And where trade flowed, so too did control. The next step in our journey lies beneath vaulted markets and desert roads, the merchants, the routes, the wealth that stitched the empire together. The caravanserai outside Aleppo stands silent now. Its courtyard, once filled with the sounds of haggling traders and stomping camels, lies empty. Yet the stone still holds the heat of 1,000 journeys. I walked through its arched gates just as twilight bled across the sky, and I could almost hear it. The rustle of silk, the scent of spices, the weight of coins changing hands. This was not just commerce. This was empire. The Ottomans knew that power did not always ride with soldiers. Sometimes it moved with merchants. From the markets of Cairo to the harbors of Izmir, from the bazaars of Damascus to the domed halls of Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, trade was the lifeblood of the empire. And controlling it meant shaping the destiny of 3 continents. The empire sat at a crossroads. To the east, Persia and India. To the west, Europe. To the south, Arabia and Africa. Between them stretched a network of routes older than the empire itself, veins through which gold, cloth, ivory, coffee, and ideas flowed. The Ottomans did not just inherit these paths, they organized them, taxed them, and guarded them. In the port of Alexandria, I watched the wind pull at abandoned sails. Centuries ago, these docks were crowded with ships from Venice, Genoa, and beyond. Merchants from all nations came to buy Ottoman goods, textiles, ceramics, leather, and especially silk. Ottoman silk was prized across Europe, some of it woven in the looms of Bursa, soft as breath, dyed in colors drawn from crushed roots and insects. But it was not just the products, it was the system. The Ottomans built caravanserais every few days' journey along major land routes, fortified inns where traders could rest, feed their animals, and protect their cargo. Some of these structures still stand. I stayed in one near Konya. The stone walls were thick, the rooms sparse, but the sense of purpose was clear. Trade was not a side act, it was policy. They also minted their own coins, regulated weights and measures, enforced price controls. Guilds formed in every major city, managing quality and production. The empire was not chaotic, it was coordinated. Trade gave it rhythm, gave it reach. But trade did more than enrich, it connected. Ideas traveled with goods, books, languages, medicines. Scholars walked the same roads as traders. In the cafes of Istanbul, arguments in Arabic mixed with Turkish poetry and Greek philosophy. The empire was a mosaic, and its markets were the spaces where those pieces met. Of course, trade had its shadows. Smugglers moved alongside merchants. Corruption grew where profits bloomed, and as European powers found sea routes around Africa to bypass Ottoman tolls, cracks began to show. Portuguese and Dutch ships soon brought pepper and cinnamon directly from the Indies, cutting into profits once protected by geography. Still, for centuries, the Ottomans thrived on the control of movement. They knew that to tax a road is to own it, and to own a road is to write history, one caravan at a time. As I left the caravanserai that evening, the sky had deepened to a bruised purple. A single lantern flickered in the breeze, its light barely holding against the dark. But in that moment, I felt it, the empire breathing through its roads, its markets, its exchanges. And just beyond those markets, another kind of power stirred, not in ledgers or coin purses, but on the sea, in sails blackened by gunpowder, in the flags of Corsairs who rode with the Ottomans and hunted the coasts of Europe. The tide was turning, and the Barbary Corsairs were waiting. Salt clung to the wind as I stood on the rocky shores of Algiers. The sea stretched endlessly before me, glittering under the noonday sun. But in the 16th century, this water was not serene. It was a battlefield, a hunting ground. The Mediterranean once echoed with cannon fire and screams as Ottoman-backed Corsairs ruled its waves. These were the Barbary Corsairs, pirates to some, patriots to others. To the empire, they were something more, a weapon. The Barbary coast, stretching from modern-day Morocco to Libya, became a frontier of Ottoman power, not through conquest alone, but through alliance. Local rulers pledged loyalty to the sultan. In return, they gained protection, resources, and most importantly, legitimacy. From ports like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, Corsairs launched their ships like arrows, striking fear into Christian Europe. Their most famous leaders became legends. Hayreddin Barbarossa was one. Born in Lesbos, once a sailor, he rose to command fleets that shattered European squadrons. His name, meaning Redbeard, still stirs old coastal towns. I found a weathered stone tablet near the harbor in Algiers, etched with the Ottoman Tugra. It marked the old naval command, Barbarossa's seat. The paint had long since faded, but the symbol remained, carved deep by time and tide. The Corsairs were not chaotic raiders. They operated under strict systems. Captains were chosen based on experience. Prizes were divided according to rules. Ships flew Ottoman flags, and a share of the loot always went back to the empire. This was sanctioned piracy. Corsairing is policy. They targeted merchant ships, coastal villages, even island monasteries. Slavery was part of the trade. Thousands were captured and sold, men, women, and children. Some were ransomed. Others vanished. For many Europeans, the word Turk became synonymous with terror at sea. But for the Ottomans, the Corsairs were more than thieves. They were scouts, shields, instruments of projection. I sailed along part of their old route near the Balearic Islands. The water was deceptively calm, yet beneath the surface lies centuries of wreckage, galleys, treasure, bones. The Corsairs knew every current, every hidden cove. They used fast ships, often captured and refitted. They were nimble, deadly, and rarely fought fair. But their influence went beyond the blade. The Corsairs carried letters between courts. They enforced tribute payments. They spread Ottoman culture and language into North Africa. Algiers and Tunis became cultural hubs where calligraphy met canon, and Arabic poems were recited under crescent moon banners. Their greatest victory came in 1538 when Barbarossa crushed a Christian fleet near Preveza. It secured Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean for decades. European powers were stunned. The sea they thought was theirs had turned against them, and yet power built on piracy has its costs. The Corsairs grew bolder. Some defied orders, others kept more loot than they should. As European navies improved, the balance shifted. French and British fleets began pushing back. Fortresses once thought impregnable were shelled into silence. The very autonomy that made the Barbary states useful also made them unpredictable. Still, the Corsairs left their mark. In architecture, in language, in the nightmares of coastal towns and the ballads of survivors, they turned the Mediterranean from a Roman lake into an Ottoman shield. As the wind picked up along the Algerian coast, I watched a small fishing boat pass into the horizon. Its sail was simple, but I imagined it once bore the crescent flag. In these waters, memory never really fades. And now, as the sea quiets, we turn to a different kind of battle, not fought with oars and fire, but with fleets of faith, and a clash that would shake the illusion of Ottoman invincibility. The waves lead us to Lepanto, where the tide turned, and where silence would no longer be a shield. The water off the coast of western Greece is calm now, too calm. I stood there near Naupactos, staring out at a sea that once roared with cannon fire and the screams of dying men. The Battle of Lepanto, 1571, a clash of civilizations, of empires, of faiths. It was more than a naval battle. It was the moment the illusion cracked, the illusion that the Ottomans were unstoppable. For over a century, the empire had expanded in all directions. From the walls of Vienna to the shores of Yemen, few dared to resist. And on the water, their fleets had ruled. The Corsairs of the Barbary coast had humbled Christian navies. Ottoman galleys cut through the Mediterranean like knives through silk. But power breeds resistance. Pope Pius V saw the threat growing, so he formed the Holy League, an alliance of Spain, Venice, Genoa, and the Papal States, old rivals brought together by fear. They gathered more than 200 ships, tens of thousands of men, and set sail to stop Ottoman dominance. Ali Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, sailed to meet them with equal confidence. His navy was vast, experienced, and had not known real defeat in generations. When the two forces met off the coast of Lepanto, it was the largest naval battle in the Western world since antiquity. I visited the bay. Locals still speak of the ghosts. Some say that on foggy mornings you can hear the sound of drums and splintering wood. The battle began at dawn. Galleys lined up in formations so vast that it seemed the sea had grown walls of wood and steel. The Holy League had one key advantage: firepower. They had more arquebusiers and stronger galleons, and perhaps, most importantly, they had Don John of Austria, a young and daring commander with a keen sense of timing. When the fleets collided, it was chaos. Smoke blanketed the sea. Arrows and bullets rained. Boarding parties clashed with swords and axes. The water turned red. Ali Pasha's flagship held the center, but when it fell, its commander killed, its standard taken, the Ottoman line began to collapse. By sunset, over 100 Ottoman ships had been captured or destroyed. More than 20,000 of their men were dead or captured. the Holy League had lost fewer, but the damage on both sides was immense. In the Empire, the defeat was quietly acknowledged but never truly accepted. Chronicles mention it, but with restraint, perhaps because Lepanto did not end Ottoman power. Their navy was rebuilt within a year. Their empire remained vast. And yet, something had changed. It was not the loss of ships, it was the loss of certainty. Lepanto was proof that the Ottomans could be beaten, that the Christian world could unite, that the empire's reach had limits. The psychological blow rippled through the courts of Europe and the palaces of Istanbul. It shifted the balance, just enough. Standing on that shore, the sea whispering at my feet, I imagined the silence after the final cannon, the smoke clearing, the shattered masts drifting like ghosts. It must have felt like the world itself had held its breath. But empires do not fall in a single day, and this was not the end. It was a fracture, a warning, one that would echo for centuries in the decisions of sultans and the whispers of advisors. The illusion had cracked, but the surface still held, for now. Yet beneath it, a quieter danger stirred, one not from cannon or sail, but from within. In the chambers of scholars, in the silence of closed libraries, something was missing. Curiosity, progress. The next chapter leads us into the shadows of the mind, where innovation once thrived and then began to fade. I climbed the hill overlooking Istanbul, where the old observatory of Tachi al-Din once stood. Nothing remains of it now. No domes, no instruments. Just a faint outline in the earth where knowledge was once measured against the stars. In the 16th century, this was one of the most advanced observatories in the world. And then, it was destroyed. Not by war, but by fear. The Ottoman Empire had once been a haven for scholars, architects, engineers, and poets. From the precise domes of Sinan to the medical texts copied in palace libraries, innovation had lived here. It was in the air, in the calligraphic ink, in the carved wood of astrolabes. But as centuries passed, that flame began to dim. The reasons are complex: cultural, political, spiritual, but the effect was clear. While Europe entered the scientific revolution, publishing books, challenging old models, and embracing invention, the Ottomans began to look inward, cautious, conservative, suspicious of change. One moment often marks this turning point: the destruction of the Istanbul Observatory in 1580. Tachi al-Din had built it under the patronage of Sultan Murad III. It had enormous sextants, celestial globes, and precision instruments rivaling anything in Europe. Tachi al-Din was a genius. He calculated planetary motion, wrote treatises on optics, even improved on Greek and Arabic models of astronomy. And yet, within just a few years, the observatory was ordered closed, then demolished. Religious advisors warned that such studies were impious, that observing the heavens too closely disturbed the divine order. The stars were not for men to measure. They were signs, not systems. That message echoed louder with time. I walked through the ruins of a madrasa in Bursa, its arches broken, its walls faded. In one of the remaining classrooms, an old blackboard still bore a lesson written long ago: mathematics, drawn with care. This was once a center of learning. Now it is a relic, a place more for tourists than thinkers. It was not just science that suffered. The printing press, invented in Europe in the mid-15th century, was banned for use in Arabic script in the Ottoman Empire for nearly 300 years. Officials feared it would lead to heresy, or worse, undermine the power of the scribes and religious elite. By the time printing was allowed in the early 18th century, Europe had already passed through the Enlightenment. Meanwhile, innovation slowed. Old texts were copied, not questioned. Discoveries were preserved, not pursued. The empire became a guardian of knowledge, but rarely a creator. And that shift, subtle, quiet, corrosive, affected everything. Military tactics lagged behind. Economic ideas remained rigid. Technologies were adopted late, if at all. In the records of palace treasuries, you can trace the decline. Fewer books imported, fewer instruments commissioned, more expenditures on luxury, on ceremony, on holding onto what was be. But decline does not mean absence. There were always exceptions. Individual scholars who still burned with curiosity, artisans who still pushed boundaries, but they were isolated, unfavored, and too often forgotten. The empire still stood. Its walls still held. Its armies still marched. But its mind had begun to drift into sleep. And as I stood where stars were once charted, I looked to the sky. The constellations were unchanged. The heavens still turned. But the empire had stopped watching. Yet innovation is not the only thing that can fray an empire. Power, when stretched too far, begins to thin. And on the edges of the empire, in distant provinces and forgotten alleys, new forces were rising. Governors no longer waited for orders. Local power was beginning to speak with its own voice, and soon the center would begin to feel the pull. In the heart of Damascus, I found a crumbling archive tucked behind a locked gate. Dust hung in the air like memory. Inside, old records lay scattered across stone floors. Tax ledgers, marriage certificates, land grants. Most bore the seal of the Ottoman Sultan, but others carried different marks. Local emblems, names that did not belong to Istanbul. It was here that I began to feel the slow uncoiling of empire. The Ottomans had ruled from the center for centuries. The Sultan's word echoed from Topkapi to the farthest desert outpost. But power, like water, seeks its own path. And over time, the flow began to shift. In the provinces, places like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and the Balkans, new voices grew louder. Governors, once appointed, began to act like kings. In theory, these men were agents of the empire. Their titles came from the capital, their robes, their authority, their coins, all from the Sultan's court. But in practice, distance changed everything. Travel was slow, communication unreliable. And in that space between command and compliance, autonomy took root. I read one letter from the governor of Baghdad to the palace. It was filled with formal language, respectful tones, and hidden defiance. Taxes had been withheld, troops not sent, orders delayed, and the reply from Istanbul was terse but toothless. The center could no longer enforce its will with the speed or strength it once had. Local dynasties began to form. In Egypt, the Mamluks, once defeated by the Ottomans, resurfaced in new clothes. They ran the country as their own, collecting revenue, building armies, and treating the Sultan more like a distant partner than a master. In the Balkans, Christian landlords quietly reasserted control. In Arabia, tribal leaders ignored Ottoman edicts entirely. I walked through a provincial palace in Aleppo. Faded frescoes lined the hallways. The ceiling had collapsed in one wing, but the grandeur remained. This was not a minor post. This was a court in its own right. Entertainers, scholars, guards, all local. All loyal not to the empire, but to the man who paid them. Corruption followed. Without oversight, tax collectors took more than they were owed. Bribes became policy. Justice grew uneven. The peasant bore the weight. And in the absence of strong imperial presence, rebellion began to stir. Quiet at first. A missing tribute, a skirmish on the border. Then louder, revolts, mutinies, uprisings. Even the Janissaries, once the iron core of the empire, began settling in provincial towns. There, they opened shops, married, joined local politics. And soon, they too were answering not to Istanbul, but to local lords who knew their names and shared their interests. The result was fragmentation. The empire still existed in name, but in function it was becoming a quilt of semi-independent territories, each stitched loosely to the center. The illusion of unity held, but only just. This rise of provincial power was not just a political shift, it was a symptom of distance, of overreach, of an empire too large, too complex, too slow to adapt. And as I left the archive that day, the wind lifting old pages into the air, I understood what it meant. The heart was still beating, but the limbs were moving on their own. And beyond the provinces, a storm gathered on the horizon. One final reach westward, one final gamble. Vienna, the gateway to Europe, the dream of conquest that refused to die. But dreams, when pushed too far, often turn into collapse. Autumn leaves crunched beneath my boots as I walked the old battlefield outside Vienna. The air was sharp, the trees fading to gold, and the wind carried a strange quiet, as if the land still remembered. It was here in the year 1683 that the Ottoman Empire made one last thunderous attempt to conquer the heart of Europe. The Siege of Vienna was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a dream unraveling. The Ottomans had tried once before, in 1529 under Suleiman the Magnificent. That attempt failed, stopped by weather and walls. But the ambition never died. Vienna was not just a city, it was a symbol. A gateway. If it fell, the path to Western Europe would open. The empire would stretch from Mecca to the Danube, from Baghdad to the Rhine. So in the summer of 1683, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led a massive army northward. Historians estimate it held over 100,000 men. Ottoman troops, Janissaries, artillery, cavalry, and allies from across the empire. They moved with purpose, confidence. The Sultan himself stayed behind in Edirne, trusting the vizier to bring glory home. Vienna stood with fewer than 20,000 defenders. The odds seemed impossible, but within its walls a determination burned. They reinforced gates, stockpiled grain, dug in, and they waited. The siege began in July. The Ottomans surrounded the city, cutting off supplies. Their engineers began tunneling under the walls, packing the ground with explosives. Cannons roared day and night. Each day, the outer defenses grew weaker. Hunger spread inside. Disease followed. Still, Vienna held. I stood near the old Lobobastai bastion, one of the points where Ottoman mines exploded beneath the defenses. The stone is cracked, scorched, but still standing. You can almost hear the echoes of gunfire in the silence of early morning. As weeks passed, Europe began to stir. News of the siege spread like fire. A holy league was formed. Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, German states. Old rivalries were set aside. At the head of the relief force rode King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, a general of unmatched skill leading an army of roughly 70,000. They moved swiftly, gathering near the Kahlenberg Hills above Vienna. On September 12th, the Ottomans awoke to smoke rising on the ridges. The relief army descended like thunder. The final blow came from Sobieski himself, leading one of the largest cavalry charges in history, over 20,000 riders crashing into the Ottoman flank. The siege collapsed. The Ottoman army broke. Kara Mustafa fled, his dreams shattered. He would later be executed on the Sultan's orders, a silken cord around his neck, a final silent punishment for overreaching. Vienna had survived. Europe rejoiced, and the Ottomans, for the first time in generations, had truly been pushed back. But this was not just a military loss. It was the end of an era, the last serious attempt to expand into Europe. The empire would fight on, hold territory, strike deals, but the tide had turned. The illusion of inevitability had been broken. As I walked back through the modern city, where cafes now line the streets once scarred by cannon fire, I wondered, what drives an empire to stretch so far? Is it glory, fear, or the belief that without expansion, decline is certain? After Vienna, the Ottomans began to look inward. But even there, change was coming, not through conquest, through reform, through proclamations written in golden script. And in the next chapter, we find those promises, etched in law, wrapped in hope. The Tanzimat reforms, a last great effort to catch a world already moving faster. In the echoing halls of the Sublime Porte, I found a fragile document sealed with golden script. The ink was faded, the paper brittle, but the words still pulsed with urgency. This was the Hatti Serif of Gulhane, issued in 1839, a declaration of change, of rebirth. The Tanzimat reforms had begun, and with them, the Ottoman Empire reached for something it had long resisted: modernity. Tanzimat means reorganization. It was not just a political shift, it was a last, sweeping attempt to bring the empire in line with a rapidly changing world. Europe had moved into the industrial age. Its empires were expanding, innovating, revolutionizing. The Ottomans, still proud but strained, faced internal unrest, external pressure, and the looming shadow of irrelevance. So in that year, under Sultan Abdulmajid, the first decree was announced. In a public ceremony in the Rose Garden of Topkapi Palace, it promised equal rights for all subjects regardless of religion. It vowed to reform taxation, ensure fair trials, and protect property. For the first time, Muslim, Christian, and Jew would be declared equal under Ottoman law. It was bold, revolutionary, and risky. I walked the streets of Istanbul where those words were first read aloud. The city was watching itself change. Old guards frowned from behind lattice windows. Young bureaucrats in European suits hurried through alleyways. Coffee houses buzzed with debate. Some saw a new future, others saw betrayal. The reforms reached deep. New ministries were formed. Military conscription was standardized. Schools were modernized. New civil codes, drawn partly from French models, replaced older, religiously based systems. A national postal service, railroads, telegraph lines, a census. The very bones of a modern state were being laid. But not everyone wanted this new body. In the provinces, local leaders resisted. Corruption flourished under the veil of reform. Tax collectors simply demanded more. Religious leaders feared a loss of identity. Many Muslims questioned the wisdom of placing Christians and Jews legally beside them. The very fabric that had held the empire together, its hierarchy, its structure, was being rewritten. I found a ledger in a regional courthouse in the Balkans. It recorded property disputes between villagers, one Muslim, one Orthodox Christian. The judge ruled in favor of the Christian. A quiet victory for justice, perhaps, but also a spark in a dry field. Riots followed. Trust was fragile. By the 1850s and 60s, the reforms accelerated. The empire adopted new commercial laws, allowed foreign investors deeper access. Railways connected more cities. A secular legal system began to rise beside the old religious courts. In 1876, the empire even adopted a constitution, the first in its history. A parliament was born, but it was short-lived. The constitution was suspended within 2 years. The sultan, fearful of losing power, dissolved the assembly and ruled again with firm authority. The dream of constitutional monarchy was shelved. The reforms continued in name but lost momentum. Their heart had faltered. Still, the Tanzimat era left its mark. It reshaped the Ottoman state, created new institutions, new classes, and a new language of governance. It inspired future reformers, young intellectuals, and revolutionaries. It offered hope, but also revealed the depth of the empire's divisions. As I stepped out of the archive into the fading light, I felt that tension between what was promised and what was possible, between vision and execution, between empire and people. And as the 19th century closed, a new label was whispered in the salons of Europe. The sick man of Europe, a phrase that would cling to the Ottomans like a shadow. But what does it mean to be sick, and who decides when the end has come? The next step of our journey leads to that twilight, a century of decline, diplomacy, and desperate strength, where the empire still stood, but staggered. And behind every treaty, every loss, every whispered insult, a question lingered. How does an empire die? In a quiet corner of Salonika, I found an old townhouse with broken shutters and vines curling through its stonework. The door creaked open to rooms long abandoned, the floorboards soft with rot. It was here, locals said, that a young Ottoman officer once lived. His name was Mustafa Kemal. But before he became a revolutionary, before he led the Republic, he walked through these very halls under the weight of a dying empire. An empire the world had begun to call the sick man of Europe. The phrase was born in the drawing rooms of European powers, not in the East but in the West, a term cloaked in diplomacy yet steeped in disdain. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer feared. It was managed, pitied, ailing, its borders frayed, its finances strained, its politics tangled in a web of foreign interests and internal doubt. Maps from this era tell a story of retreat. Territories once held firm were now shaded in new colors. Greece, Egypt, Serbia, gone. Bosnia and Herzegovina, occupied. Tunisia, taken by the French. One by one, the limbs of empire were severed, often without a sword drawn. Treaties replaced battles. Diplomats replaced generals. And behind every signature was the assumption that the Ottomans would not last much longer. I sat in a cafe near the Bosphorus, where the old men still play backgammon under plane trees. They remember stories told by grandfathers, how foreign advisors roamed the ministries, how railroads were built with British steel, how even the banks no longer truly belonged to the empire. Sovereignty became shared or sold. But what made it worse was the empire's silence. Publicly, the Ottomans carried on with pride. Ceremonies, uniforms, decrees in elegant script. But beneath that surface was a deep anxiety. The palace feared rebellion, the provinces drifted, and the people, tired of promises, began to look elsewhere, to new ideas, new leaders. In the heart of Istanbul, the Sultan still ruled from Topkapi, but his reach was no longer absolute. The Janissaries were gone. The bureaucracy was bloated. The army struggled to modernize. And foreign powers, Britain, France, Russia, competed for influence like wolves around a wounded stag. The Crimean War had given the empire a brief reprieve. Allied with the West, the Ottomans had stood against Russia. They even won, but victory did not strengthen them. It exposed them. It showed how deeply they depended on others and how little trust remained within their own house. I found an old newspaper in the ruins of a printing shop, dated 1878. It covered the Congress of Berlin, where European leaders redrew Ottoman borders without Ottoman consent. Their fate negotiated without their presence. Empire, once a force of destiny, had become an object of discussion. Yet even in this slow decline, the Ottomans endured, adapted, survived. They were not passive. They built railroads, reformed schools, tried new constitutions, new parliaments. But every step forward met resistance, from within and without. The shadow of the sick man was not just about power. It was about perception, about how the world saw the Ottomans, about how the Ottomans saw themselves. It became a prophecy, one that fed itself. As I left the house in Salonika, the sun dipped low behind the rooftops. The light caught the edges of broken tiles and flaking paint. There was still beauty, still memory, still something unbroken. But time was short, and in the final years of the empire, the last act would not be a slow fade. It would come in fire, in rebellion, in the clash between old order and new vision. The sultans would fall, and in their place, a republic would rise. I stood beneath the shattered windows of the last Ottoman parliament building in Istanbul. The marble steps were cracked. Ivy crawled up the columns like a silent witness. This is where it ended, not in a blaze of glory, but in slow collapse and final separation. The Ottoman Empire, once the great bridge between East and West, was gone, and from its ruins, a republic rose. The fall was not sudden. It came in waves: war, defeat, revolution. The First World War delivered the final blow. The Ottomans had aligned with the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary. When the war ended, they were on the losing side. The Treaty of Sèvres carved up their lands, Syria to the French, Iraq and Palestine to the British. Anatolia itself was to be divided. The empire that had lasted over 6 centuries was no longer sovereign. Istanbul was occupied by Allied forces. Greek troops landed in Izmir, and across Anatolia, the people watched foreign flags fly over towns their ancestors had bled for. But surrender did not mean silence. From the heart of Anatolia, a voice rose. Mustafa Kemal, the same officer who once walked the halls of Salonika, now gathered soldiers, villagers, and visionaries. He launched a resistance movement that refused to accept the empire's fate. What began as defense became revolution. I traced his steps through the hills of central Turkey, the towns he rallied, the speeches he gave. He spoke not of restoring the sultans, but of something new, a republic, a nation built not on dynasty, but on will. The War of Independence followed, fierce, desperate, but victorious. The Turkish forces drove out the invaders. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the sovereignty of a new state, not the Ottoman Empire, but the Republic of Turkey. the Sultanate was abolished. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, boarded a British ship and sailed into exile. No ceremony, no farewell parade. Just a quiet departure at dusk. The Caliphate, the spiritual leadership of Islam, was dissolved shortly after. The thread that once tied the Ottomans to millions of Muslims across continents cut. In its place, a new order began. I stood in Ankara, the new capital, and read the words etched into stone. Sovereignty unconditionally belongs to the nation. This was not just a slogan. It was a break, a reset. The empire was history, the republic was present, and the future, uncertain but unbound. The changes came fast. The script of the language was changed from Arabic to Latin. Religious courts were replaced with civil ones. Fezzes vanished. Women's rights advanced. The state turned sharply towards secularism, education, and reform. It was not easy, not without cost, but it was determined. And yet, the ghosts remain. I wandered through the courtyards of old mosques, through abandoned palaces, through libraries that once held the breath of empires. The Ottomans are gone, but their imprint is everywhere, in the arches, in the music, in the stories passed from one grandmother to another. History does not vanish, it changes shape. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the closing of an age. The world they knew had changed. Technology, borders, beliefs. The empire could not hold it all. No one could. But its legacy, that endures. In architecture, in law, in culture, in the memory of a people who once stood at the center of the world. And as I placed my hand on the cold stone of that final parliament, I did not hear silence. I heard a question, a challenge. What comes after empire? Because history does not whisper, it waits. The last light of day slipped across the Bosphorus as I stood near the ruins of an old Ottoman fort, its stones warm from centuries of sun. The call to prayer drifted through the air, soft and steady. It reminded me that while empires may fall, their echoes never really fade. The Ottoman Empire was not a single story. It was a mosaic, layered, shifting, alive. It held warriors and poets, scientists and merchants, sultans and slaves. It stretched across 3 continents, endured for over 6 centuries, and shaped the world in ways we still walk through today. Its legacy is etched in architecture, in the domes that seem to defy gravity, in the legal codes that once balanced justice with faith, in the coffee houses where ideas brewed alongside strong, dark cups, in the music, in the language, in the way memory clings to place. The Ottomans were not always just, not always wise, but they were human, and like all who rise to power, they believed, at least for a time, that their order could last forever, that the center would always hold. But history does not work that way. It shifts, it forgets, it begins again. The fall of the empire was not just a loss, it was a transformation, a door closing so another could open. The Republic of Turkey was born from that shift, carved from the bones of empire, shaped by those who had once served it and then chose to walk another path. And yet, when I walk the old streets of Istanbul, I still see them. The shadows of Janissaries beneath crumbling arches, the soft sway of silk in forgotten bazaars, the quiet authority of domes watching the city breathe. The Ottomans are gone, but they are not absent. Because legacy is not just what we inherit, it is what we choose to remember, what we carry forward, what we learn, And so, as I close my notebook and let the wind turn its pages, I leave you with this: empires rise, empires fall. But the questions they leave behind, those remain. Where power meets belief, where memory meets stone, where history waits for those who choose to listen.